Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. My name is Adarsh and I'm a research analyst in the Tech and Society program at Carnegie India. Over the past few years, AI compute has become the foundational ingredient for developing and deploying AI solutions. As models have grown in size and capability, the amount of computing power needed to train them has risen quickly, and compute requirements for the development of frontier models is estimated to have doubled roughly every 6 months. This shift has made compute a key factor that shapes who can build cutting edge AI solutions and how fast they can innovate. However, it has remained concentrated in the hands of a very few companies and countries. And while AI compute was earlier left to the remit of the private sector, its growing importance in driving transnational and inclusive socioeconomic growth, fostering cutting edge scientific research, and enabling better delivery of public services has propelled it to increasingly being perceived as a geostrategic resource. There is an increasing recognition that the concentration of this foundational AI resource creates systemic interdependencies that make compromise technological sovereignty and result in the development of AI solutions that lack the context to be suitably applied. This has created a new phase in which countries are racing to secure access to compute and stabilize supply chain. Some are investing heavily in local data centers or exploring domestic chip manufacturing. Others are forming partnerships with cloud providers or creating national programs to make compute more widely available. The aim across the board is the same: to ensure that researchers, startups, public institutions are able to fully exploit the potential that AI holds. To discuss the evolving idea of AI sovereignty and the different ways countries interpret and pursue it, and examine the strategic considerations governments face as they work to secure access to compute, I'm delighted to be joined by Zoe Hawkins. Zoe is the co-founder and the deputy executive director of the Tech Policy Design Institute, a non-partisan think tank in Australia dedicated to technology policy. She has led tech policy initiatives from government, big tech, academic, and think tank perspectives. And as an advisor to Australia's Minister for Communications, Zoe oversaw the development of the Online Safety Act 2021. As a member of Amazon's international public policy team, Zoe drove whole of Amazon digital policy initiatives and represented the company in international organizations. She's also a research associate at the University of Oxford and consults for the OECD as an AI expert on cloud digital infrastructure. Zoe, I'm delighted to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Adarsh. It's great to join you on Interpreting India.
I want to begin by talking about some of your work with the Oxford Internet Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about the project on the political geography of AI infrastructure that you did over there? What sort of prompted the project, and what have been some key learnings that you've taken away from it?
Absolutely. Well, I think as you laid out really clearly just before, Adarsh, this role of digital infrastructure as the kind of underpinning and in many cases, for some countries, the choke point around emerging digital power generally, but then seeing increasing attention on it because of the focus on AI. So what I would say is in the period of time that we've been doing this political geography of compute project with colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is Professor Vili Leidenwerder, who's also associated with Aalto University, and Boshi Wu. So the other three of us have been looking at this for a few years. And what's interesting is that real focus on the consequences of this infrastructure has gone up increasingly in the last year or so as that conversation has turned to AI. But we were originally looking at it from the perspective of cloud computing and digital technologies more broadly. But that focus has really come to the fore, as you'd imagine, over the last few years. I guess what I would say as well is the conversation has broadened too. So it's as much as it's focused in on AI, it's also, I think you're hearing more and more people talking about AI sovereignty, specifically. So I think that there's a lot we can unpack in this conversation around what does that mean. That paper that you're referring to and some of the work we've done there has been quite specific about the compute side of things, and really happy to talk about the findings that we've had there. But I think there's also a bigger conversation around other elements that feed into AI sovereignty. We can get into that too.
I want to specifically focus on the compute aspect of it. Yeah, in your paper on AI sovereignty, you lay out three levels of sovereignty as you define it. Can you just explain to us what the three levels are, and broadly, why do you think that classification was needed?
Of course. I think what we noticed was that this term of compute sovereignty was being increasingly used, but that often it was being used by different people to mean different things. And so the main contribution that we first wanted to make with the paper is actually providing some clarity that maybe there's three different ways of thinking about it, and we propose those levels, which I'm happy to talk through. And so it's really, number one, you hear people conceptualizing compute sovereignty as, do we have, as a country, say, do we have the relevant data centers that have the relevant AI compute within our territory? So the first level is really taking a geographic viewpoint. Do I have territorial and jurisdictional control over this core resource, as you've put it? And so the second layer is asking the question of, okay, if you have that digital infrastructure within your borders, the second level is the question of ownership. So who owns that infrastructure? Because obviously in many cases it might be owned by a locally owned company, maybe it's owned by the government, or maybe it is actually owned and operated and controlled by a foreign country. And if so, who? And that is relevant as well to this question of, I guess, the level of control that countries feel they have over this core infrastructure. And then the third level is going one level down further and going and say, well, these data centers rely on powerful AI chips, or often referred to as that include the category, you might have heard the term GPU for your listeners, graphic processing unit. So really the chips that sit inside these data centers, where do they come from and who makes those? And this sort of three-layer concept is just to try and bring some specificity. So when, for example, so the different, whether it's policymakers, whether it's business leaders, can have a really clear conversation about what their goals are, because there's merit to all three versions of that conversation, but we want to avoid the confusion of people making important decisions when they're talking about it.
Now, in your, I think we hear it more broadly that there's a concentration of these resources, but I think your research lays that out very well. So just across these three levels, can you just give us a sense of what that concentration in terms of percentage, in terms of number of providers actually looks like?
Absolutely. So the research that we did is a census looking at the data centers that are positioned around the world, that are owned by three of the leading American hyperscalers coming out of China, and those coming out of Europe as well. So we looked at 9 companies and their global footprint, and where those data centers are, and what AI capabilities those data centers do and don't have. And to your point, Adarsh, it paints a really interesting picture on level 1, which is just where are they? What we found was that actually only 33 countries in the world have data centers of these companies. That, like, obviously there's a specific group we're looking at, but only 33 countries have what we're terming sort of AI relevant data centers based on the types of chips that they have in them. And that sounds like a small number, but it gets even smaller actually, because there's 2 types of compute of sort of AI relevant data centers that you can have. There's those that are positioned really well to do the big sort of training and development of new AI models. It takes a lot of computing power and energy. And then there's those that are well positioned to do more deployment use of AI that's called inferencing, right? So we separated in the study the difference between training relevant data centers and compute versus inferencing relevant. And what we found is, of the 33 countries that have any AI relevant data centers at all, actually only 24 of those have that most powerful category of the cutting edge chips that are required to do that really compute intensive training of new models. So it paints a pretty stark picture. I guess the good news for us is that both India and Australia sit in that that category of the 24. But there's lots to talk about in terms of the distribution around the world and who's left out, I guess.
And the implication of countries that are, as you term it, compute deserts, or that only have the data centers that support inferencing, are what exactly? So
Yeah.
what does that imply for them, and
Oh, I
why
see.
why is it that when everyone is thinking of compute sovereignty, they're thinking about getting that highest level of chip access?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons that we've heard and in the research that comes through is this idea of, if it's within your territory, this resource, that you maybe have an opportunity, if you're looking at it from the government point of view, you have jurisdiction to govern it, to regulate it. There's an element of, I guess, government control that comes from that physical location. So there's a policy reason, I suppose, for some people, that motivation. There's also more practical reasons that others think this is relevant, particularly as it relates to that inferencing capability that I mentioned. The closer that you are, so, whether it's whatever device it might be that you're using that is calling to a data center for its inference, the further away that data center is, there can be something called latency, which means a bit of a lag. So I guess there are reasons from a performance point of view could be another reason that people care about where these data centers are located. But I do think that it is increasingly more about this sense of I think there's a sentiment as the geopolitical context is becoming increasingly, I guess, maybe unpredictable is one word we could use to describe it. I feel that more countries and governments feel a need to reach for this greater sense of control over these key resources. And I think part of that is also partly a hangover from the COVID experience of realizing the importance and, in some cases, the significant implications of supply chain disruption. So I think that there's a combination of reasons that this has become more front of mind for many people. But yeah, there's a range of reasons that people are interested in the location of these data centers.
Interesting. So now, for countries in the global north and developed countries who have the resources, they might be thinking about the idea of compute sovereignty across these three levels. They might be conceptualizing their policy, thinking, how do we get control possibly over all three levels, right? But for the vast majority of countries, especially in the global south, that just is not a reality. Right, you cannot be developing your own data centers, you cannot be developing your own chips. And I think that you outline in your paper that especially when it comes to AI accelerators and AI chips, Nvidia has approximately 85% of the market. Right, so it's not even just countries in the West, it's just one company in one country that controls the vast majority of these resources. So when countries are thinking about, then how do we circumvent this issue? How do we actually ensure that we have access and that we're not locked out of this technology? How should these countries be thinking about this problem?
It's a great question. I think that you've put your finger on it, which is that actually, no matter which country you're looking at it from, the concentration of power in these supply chains is significant, right? Whether you're, a country in the global north or the global south, as you put it, I think that there's no getting away from the concentration in that market, particularly in terms of the Nvidia's control, as you say. I think what that means is there's increasing focus for governments as to what levers do they have in their disposal. What we're seeing is that there's an increasing dynamic, I think, between governments and some of these big tech companies. We're seeing a sort of interesting imbalance in the negotiating power because countries around the world feel this pressure to attract that investment from these private sector companies. There is almost this competition between countries to be the more attractive place that these companies choose to make their investment, choose to put their digital infrastructure. And so that's the first thing I'd say, is that there's a sense of competition. And, whether it's trying to portray an attractive investment environment, whether that's to do with the tax settings or whether it's around availability of affordable energy, because obviously these data centers are very resource hungry. There's a bunch of different ways that governments think about trying to make themselves attractive. But the thing that strikes me the most is that, as you say, there's a imbalance between the number of countries around the world that want this resource and the number of places that it's being put. And so what are countries to do in that situation? Well, I think it's sensible to want, every country on any issue wants to be an attractive place for investment, I think, an attractive place to do business. That's the first thing. But of course, we want there to be a limit to that. So it's also about how, I know that in many cases there is an interest in developing like a local industry. Competing with these global hyperscalers, as you say, for most is not going to be on the cards. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a place that within each economy that there can't be some specializations where smaller industries can develop. There's also something we're seeing around how there can be regional solutions or attempts at collaboration to sort of share access to compute in particular areas. I mean, there was obviously efforts towards this in Europe, which sort of weren't as successful as was hoped. But that sentiment of how can we maybe multiple countries can almost pool that bargaining power and become negotiate almost as a block, which I think is quite interesting. I mean, and I will stay on compute because I appreciate that's the particular focus. But one of my findings in my broader research is that you have to, I think for all countries, I mean, Australia included, we're looking at this right now, we're not going to be able to lead on a lot of these issues. And actually true what we might call sovereignty or we're calling AI agency comes from stepping back and seeing the full list of capabilities that go into a successful AI ecosystem and working out where any country, whether that's India or whether Australia, where you can become an indispensable contributor in the full stack so that there's a stronger bargaining position on the bits where you can't lead. So say compute is out of reach for being, maybe the country that you're in is not going to necessarily produce the next AWS. Okay, but what are the other elements of the AI ecosystem that you do have leverage on? And that will be different for every country. But I think asking that bigger question helps create a more strategic position that helps secure your access to compute and puts you in a better position to make sure that supply is secure.
That's a very interesting take. So one of the parts of the AI conversation in India has been that because you do not have this foundational resource, what you can try and do is you can innovate when it comes to use cases, right? You can innovate when it comes to solutions. And essentially try and become the use case capital of the world, right? But that necessarily then precludes you from contributing further down the value chain if you try and focus on just the applications part of it. What would you think of an approach like this? When you talk about trying to create value in one part of the value chain, do you think that this is a good approach?
I do, because I think it's realistic. I think it's pragmatic. I think, we as part of the Tech Policy Design Institute, again, another collaboration with researchers at the Oxford Internet Institute, we've just released a paper that says there's 101 capability areas that is relevant to an AI ecosystem. There's so many different areas, and it's through infrastructure, which is obviously a really big part of this. That's everything, the data centers, the resources, because it's not just the data centers, right? It's the critical minerals, it's the sustainable energy sources, connectivity, all these things. There's the data side of things, models, and you mentioned, it could be foundational models, or it could be the general applications that build on the top of them, which, for example, is a place that Australia has a particular strong capability. Or it's maybe in the innovation culture. So maybe it's about, are you developing new AI companies? That actually is another source of strength. And then there's skills. So I think that's a really particular strength for India as well. So are you producing talent that makes you a really relevant player in the world of people who are coming out with skills about how to develop AI, how to govern AI? And then the lastly is the governance bit, the governance layer, which is about, do you have a trustworthy environment where, businesses have confidence and clarity about how their operations will play out. There's a range, and that all plays into that question about competing to be a place, it almost comes full circle, because if you're strong on all of those 101 things, you also become a more attractive place for the infrastructure. So I think it kind of goes all the way around. So I personally, and that is the finding that we've had with this research, this idea that AI agency should take a bigger view both of what is relevant to AI, those capabilities, but this idea as well that you're not going to necessarily be able to own and control every element of all parts of that stack. No country can do that. Honestly, not even the US and China will be in a position where they're not relying on somebody for something. That's just a global economy, right? But also it's talking about, do you have access to the international capability that you want? Do you have control over the things that you need to control? Because there's always going to be things that should be domestically owned and operated for national security reasons. But do you have choice? Are you resilient? That point about supply chain disruption. Can you choose? Do you have enough supply between those various different options? And have you developed enough strong capabilities so that you have leverage in the global market because other people depend on you for those capabilities? So we lay out this concept of an AI agency tool that maps this idea of access, control, choice, and leverage as an expanded concept of AI sovereignty that offers a more pragmatic policy pathway for countries that other than the US and China, right? Got to broaden that conversation.
I want to go back to that point on control and tie it into the idea of governance through compute. Right? This is something that you talk about in your paper, in one of your papers, but this is something that I've also come across from other scholars, that compute itself could be used as a tool for AI governance, just because it's the physical hardware, it's detectable, it's quantifiable, and hence excludable, essentially traceable. There is this idea that you could build possibly kill switches into AI chips themselves as a method to exert control, right? As the politicization of sort of these resources becomes more and more, that could be something in the future that we look at, as is the case with, let's say, military hardware. Right. What does that then do to the idea and to the sort of calculation of sovereignty, especially at the last level?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it goes to the heart of this issue, isn't it? Which is essentially that it's control, but it's also trust in the continuing supply and that unpredictability that all countries are trying to mitigate. I think that that is the sentiment behind that as well reflects conversations that we've seen with other technologies. If you think about the 5G conversations around Huawei in critical networks in different countries around the world, this isn't a fully new concept, this question of global digital infrastructure stacks and trust in which countries they come from. But you're right that it, I think, is putting a particular pressure because more and more and more of our, not just our economies and our societies, but government operations are relying on this infrastructure. So I think the question you're asking is very important. I don't have the final answer to that, and I think it's the reason that we need to keep having these conversations. And it's the reason why we keep contributing to this, to say, actually, we need better language and better evidence about what are the issues that policymakers care about. And I think you've identified one that is a really important question. Where are different countries sitting now? How do we assess the current level of control that we have? And what would you do to get around that? I think unfortunately there's a reality that that's quite a hard position to get out of in a scenario, as you say, where Nvidia, if that's the company that you're kind of referring to, has such a global dominance in the market. I guess it's just asking for some disruption. But in the meantime, we'll have to have some very pragmatic and serious policy conversations about where that risk can be tolerated and how it should be mitigated.
Now, one of the sort of solutions that you also spoke of to circumvent this issue of access has been one, public sector investment into compute, and two, regional solutions. Right? You pointed to the EU's Euro HPC initiative. Nvidia, in partnership with this company called Cassava in Africa, is now building data centers that are expected to have something around 12,000 AI chips across the next few years. UK has invested some money to build public sector compute, and at the same time, a country like India is subsidizing access to it. What do you make of this? Do you think that a public sector approach could be a potential solvent to this issue, or do you think that this should be left to the remit of the private sector, as has been argued in many cases that in fact, it should be the role of the government should be to build up these technologies from the ground up, but not necessarily subsidize access to it, etc.
Well, that's very interesting. I think there's definitely a role for public.
I'm sorry. Just seeing that the Euro HPC initiative was in 2018 and now we're in 2025, it gives you some sense of it's obviously a very short timeline, but it still gives you some sense of whether an initiative like that could work. Right?
Definitely. Well, there's no doubt the complexity of these proposed projects, or as you say, the role of government in if you're looking at it from like a broader economy perspective, everyone's going to have a different view on what a government's role in that should be. But I do think that it's pretty I don't think it's controversial to say that government supporting sort of core national interest research infrastructure that I think is aligned to a lot of existing programs, at least in Australia and I'm sure in other countries as well, this idea that a baseline level of research and innovation capability is something that there's a national interest in. Exactly how programs are designed to subsidize access to that, I think often that's in the details. The question about, what's most effective might be in how that subsidized access is managed. But absolutely, I think if you're talking about because using AI compute to conduct important research underpins so many other areas of national competitiveness, right? Whether you're talking about, biotechnology, like just other areas of innovation, it's so cross-cutting that I can see the argument for that. I can see the argument for wanting to make sure that, local researchers have access to that resource. And well-designed government programs that provide that seem like a good idea to me.
And this idea is also feeding into, for example, the upcoming AI summit, where there's a big push towards creating transnational capabilities. So essentially, create like a hub for compute, create a hub for data sets and other resources that researchers, startups, etc., could tap into from. Especially countries in the global south where they don't have access to all of this. There's this very interesting push and pull, right? On the one hand, you have a big push towards sovereign capabilities and at least this rhetoric of that we need sovereignty, we need control over the supply chain. But at the same time, recognizing the problem that, well, there's a possibility that you won't be able to get access over at least all parts of it. You're sort of trying to go towards transnational capabilities. Do you think something like that would work? And what are the sort of considerations that should go into developing something like that?
I very much agree with the issue you're pointing to here, which is we really need to move away from a mindset on this that is binary. The idea that you're going to either that there's a version where you either are totally sovereign or you're not. This idea where any country is going to lead on all elements of AI or you're not. I think we need to get to dig that one layer down, and whether that's achieving a greater sense of control or access by collaborating with partner countries and doing that in a more of a consortium kind of approach, or whether it's viewing it more strategically as one country and saying, okay, we're not going to lead in this capability, but we're going to get some leverage over here. I think thinking about this in more detail with more specifics and moving away from binary thinking is the first essential step. And I do think that the public debate often feels very black and white on this, as if there's a mode of saying this country has AI sovereignty and it doesn't. I just think that doesn't exist. And so I think we're still at the phase, where we're trying to evolve and mature the conversation. And part of that is even just having the language to do it. That's part of what we're trying to contribute with this idea of the 108 capabilities in our typology, is to say, let's first name all of these things and agree what's possible, and then talk about what you currently have as a country, and then talk about what you need and want. But I feel like we're trying to solve that last question of do we, we need and want to have control over AI generally, but we're not first answering these questions of what are we talking about and what do we already have. So I think, shared language with greater detail and granularity about what we mean, and getting more evidence about what we do and don't already have. Because I feel like often this conversation happens at in many cases, it's very evidence-based and essential pressure that's being put on policymakers to solve things. But I do think in other cases, it can be quite sovereignty is a highly charged concept. And I think no one's going to disagree with the idea we should have more sovereignty, because I feel that in some senses it sort of sells itself. Mm-hmm. So it's really easy to agree with. But I think understanding exactly what that means can be quite difficult. So how do we have a more specific conversation? It, for me, is the biggest goal.
So because of this sort of obscure amorphous term, you don't actually know what you're trying to get to.
Exactly. How can you design good policy to get to an outcome that nobody can even describe? What does that look like? And I think that until we can describe what's possible and where we currently are today, only then can we think about where we could go and then decide where we want to go. And so I think we're actually several steps back from where people are trying to have this conversation. I think we'll get there, but it does take a little bit of work.
Now, another thing something that is very interesting that you point to is that when countries are developing their own strategies, what they're doing is tending to either go towards the US camp or the China camp, or if they're somewhere in the sort of neutral in their relationship with both countries, they're trying to hedge and have sort of access from both of these broader camps. Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe give us examples of which countries are sort of fall in either of these camps?
Thanks, Adarsh. I think this is a really interesting part of the research, really, because it gives more nuance to what's happening here, which is not just, it's 24 countries in the world that are home to AI compute. And the question is that second layer of compute sovereignty, who owns those and where are they? Now, of course, what we're counting in this study is the location of privately owned commercial data centers. So we're appreciating, and it's an important caveat that obviously in that sense, the government in most cases doesn't actually have a role in terms of, exactly where those private sector entities are locating their properties. But I think it's a good analogy. And so we have borrowed this analogy from international relations of those countries that are hedging and sort of having access to, as you say, the tech stack from both the US and China. And what we found is of those countries that have the compute, actually 18 were relying on just one of those, whereas 12 were hedging. So the takeaway is more countries are only on one of those countries' tech stack, and a fewer number of countries have got a mix. And I found that quite interesting, because that does point to, I think what would be interesting is to track that over time and see if and how this changes, right, over multiple years, because these investments take time to build and all these sorts of things. And this was taken as a snapshot in time at last year. But the fact that 18 countries are on just either the US AI data centers or Chinese is interesting. And of those 18, the balance also isn't split. I was quite interested that of the 18, 13 countries are relying only on one of the 3 US hyperscalers, as opposed to 5 countries that are exclusively on the Chinese hyperscalers. So, 13 that are relying only on US hyperscalers include Switzerland, Italy, and Israel as a few examples, whereas some of the 5 that are relying exclusively on Chinese hyperscalers include Thailand, Malaysia, Chile, and Indonesia as an example. And there's countries that are currently demonstrating a mix and have access to both of those tech stacks. There's 12 of them, and that includes sort of Singapore, France, Germany, and I actually believe India as well. So it does paint an interesting picture in terms of how different countries are positioned in terms of that diversity of access, I guess. And if you take a resilience view, we could have a big debate, I'm sure, as to like which one is more favorable, but it's just an interesting trend, and then one I would really like to see mapped over time, because I think that is where you'll start to see really interesting trends, not just in, I guess, the sentiment in those various different markets but also the success and dominance over time of the relevant different companies, right? Because it isn't just, as much as we're sort of in this scenario using these companies as a proxy for government, for country dominance at like a global level. Obviously, in some cases that's not accurate, and these companies themselves will wax and wane in their own commercial success or demise over time.
Now, one of the things that I think is less talked about, and you can sort of dispute that, one of the considerations that is, I don't think, especially when it comes to government policies not being taken that well into account, and you highlight that as well, is that there's a trade-off between environmental and socioeconomic cost that is imposed by when you're developing data center capabilities, right? So in a lot of instances, including in India, the data centers are being placed in locations which are, drought sensitive, for example. And obviously, they have a huge impact on water resources, electricity resources. Do you think this is the case, that this is a cost that is not fully being taken into account?
I think it's a really important question, and for me, it's the reason why these decisions, like many policy issues, it's important to have them holistically. I think it's very easy if we take a purely traditional supply chain security, defense, national security point of view, where you might say, okay, we want to onshore all of this infrastructure, that's what success looks like. But it perhaps misses some of those trade-offs, right? It's not just a case of the environmental cost, it's just simple resource availability. There's issues around pollution that we're hearing stories of in different places. So I think absolutely this needs to be seen as, and that's why I keep thinking it's stepping back and viewing it all in the big picture, because I think zooming in too close with only one policy lens on any part of this, and it's going to seem really obvious that you should just do all of this over here. And I don't know that when you add all those pieces together, that it's going to make a lot of sense. And particularly when governments, if part of the goal is because trying to achieve a sense of AI-enabled infrastructure so they can have an AI-enabled economy where their citizens are adopting AI, it's hard to imagine that that's the end place you're going to get to if you forget to maintain the social license of the people by considering how communities do or don't feel about the impact of the infrastructure itself. It sort of feels like it may, in fact, again, it goes back to define the goal and then work backwards from that. Because if the goal is an economy where people are adopting AI and feel positive about it, maybe that's not going to happen if they feel that their quality of life or their resources are not being at least appropriately considered, right? So I think it's partly define the policy goal and work backwards. It's understanding that every one of these policies has trade-offs, and just having the ability to have that more complete conversation, definitely. Like in the work that we've just released on AI agency, the way that we think about that is defining this concept of AI opportunity, and we're combining how feasible is it to increase your capability in a particular area? So how hard? But then also this question of desirability, because we need to recognize that there's a subjectivity to this. Some people will say, yes, all the data centers we can get, that's what we want, kind of no matter the cost. And those people would identify a massive data center build out as the massive opportunity, whereas some people would take a different calculation. And fundamentally, that's politics, right? That's on any issue, you're going to find different philosophies about how you balance security versus environment versus economics. This is just fundamental. This is no different. Just because we're talking about AI doesn't mean we're not going to come up against the same essential debates that we have across our community on any issue. And we need to account for that.
I want to pose a final question that looks sort of towards the future. There has been this, in the sort of recent past week or month, there is this renewed concern about whether we are in an AI bubble. Right? And various sort of heads of tech companies have come out Sam Altman has said that the sort of ecosystem does look a little bubbly. Sundar Pichai came out and warned against the bursting of the bubble without explicitly saying that we are in a bubble. You have sort of tech stocks taking a dive in the US, and you have, for example, the contrarian investor Michael Berry revealing that he's now short on AI. Right? So there's this renewed focus on whether we are in a bubble and what are the implications if we are. I just want to pose that question to you, looking forward, that right now all of these countries are completely focused on trying to build out their compute sort of capabilities, right? If first part of the question is that, do you think that we're in a bubble or we could be in a bubble? And two is that, if that is a possibility, what will that do to the future demand? And then how should countries then be adapting and thinking, taking that into their calculus as they're trying to develop their policy around this?
Adarsh, that's a brilliant question, and I love that you are hitting me with the hard one right at the end. And as I have to admit, not being a stock market investor or an economist, I'm not going to overstate my ability to predict whether we are in a bubble that's about to burst or not. But what I will say is that I think this speaks to an interesting relationship between government, but just people and technology, which is, I think, I find that when I listen to these conversations around the stock prices of these companies and the trajectory of this technology and demand and things, maybe it's the benefit of not being an economist, but the way I hear it is, it sounds very much like the technology is happening to us, and and that we are responding to it like kind of passively. And it kind of interests me, because I do feel that it should be the other way around. Like there should be a closer relationship between us deciding what role and what level of significance and prominence do we want AI, whether it's the digital infrastructure, whether it's the models themselves, do we want to have in our societies and our economies and communities, and design backwards from that. I find it interesting the way that economic conversation is had, that feels very like we're going to wait and see what the technology does, but it just rules out humans and the role in shaping it, which obviously at TIPD is a big part of how we think. So that's my main comment on that. I think in terms of, as you said, because there's a long tail in terms of the decisions on some of these infrastructure builds, I think that's why this is particularly challenging. And you're talking about different jurisdictions that are still in the process of considering what their regulatory position is on AI, which I think means that I think there's, like for Australia, for example, that decision hasn't fully been made. And so you have scenarios where I think there isn't a good sense of where the public trust and uptake, adoption kind of appetite is going to be, and the businesses are kind of partly waiting for a sense and signal of clarity from the government as to how easy it is going to be to do business in that country. So I think part of it as well is determined on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, with some signals and cues set by the government. So obviously that doesn't mean that the market questions and economic trajectories are government-led, but I do think it has a part to play in it, because surely where the demand is going to meet supply kind of depends on how the people who you would expect to be doing the demanding feel about the technology. So again, I think for me, any way that I come at that problem would be trying to recenter people in that question. But I mean, like you, I'll be watching with interest to see what happens, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who know more about that than me that can make some solid predictions for your listeners.
No, I think, recentering people and taking a more active role in the development of technology itself rather than being passive consumers, I think that's a good note to, I think, end the discussion on. Thank you so much for taking out the time, Zoe. And this has been a great conversation.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
No, my pleasure. And yeah. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.